The screen opens to darkness. Slowly, the faint crackle of a cigar and the clink of a whiskey glass echo through a dimly lit suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, New York City, 1931. The camera pans over velvet curtains, smoke curling under golden lamps, and men in tailored suits whose faces are half-lit, half-shadow. They speak in low tones, their words measured, their glances sharper than knives. In this room, the future of America's underworld is being redrawn. At the center sits Charles "Lucky" Luciano, calm, composed, his hands steady as he surveys the men around him. Each of them represents a city, a family, a territory soaked in blood and ambition. Outside these walls, the streets are still recovering from the violence of the Castellamarese War, but here, tonight, something entirely new is being born. Not another gang, not another boss, but a system. The narrator's voice enters, smooth and deliberate. In an era ruled by chaos, one man saw order. In a world of crime built on superstition and vengeance, he built a business. This is not just the story of Lucky Luciano, the gangster, the visionary, the manipulator. It is the story of how he created the silent machinery that would govern organized crime for nearly a century. The secret council that turned America's criminal chaos into a structured empire. The story of how power moved from the gun to the conference table. To understand the importance of this meeting, we must first understand the world that led to it. A world where immigrants flooded into America chasing dreams, only to find corruption waiting at every corner. Luciano's hidden council didn't just control rackets and gambling dens. It infiltrated unions, politics, and even legitimate industries. It blurred the line between underworld and upperworld so completely that no one could say where one ended and the other began. The camera lingers on Luciano's expression, cold yet visionary. Around him, the men raise glasses to the future. But beneath that toast lies a quiet understanding. Power shared is power that must be controlled. The commission was not just an agreement, it was a balance of fear, greed, and respect. A new world order for criminals enforced not by loyalty alone, but by profit and structure. As the smoke thickens, the voiceover deepens. History remembers kings and presidents. But in rooms like this, unseen men drew the lines that shaped cities, economies, and destinies. They built empires not from laws but from silence. The audience is left with a haunting question. Who really ran America during its golden age? The government that wrote the laws, or the council that quietly rewrote them behind closed doors? The music swells, hinting at danger and destiny. The final shot returns to Luciano, lighting another cigarette. He doesn't smile. He doesn't need to. His silence speaks for him, the confidence of a man who knows he has just changed history forever. This is where the legend begins, inside a secret room where America's shadow government was born, and a young immigrant named Lucky Luciano stepped out of the streets and into the pantheon of power. The story shifts from the smoke of the Waldorf Astoria to the gritty streets of early 20th century America, the age of immigrants, industry, and illusion. It was a time when the Statue of Liberty promised hope, yet the docks below her feet whispered a harsher truth. Welcome to America, now survive. New York City in the 1910s was a world of contradictions. Mansions lined Fifth Avenue while tenement buildings in the Lower East Side overflowed with families who had left everything behind. The air smelled of coal and desperation. Italians, Jews, Irish, and others arrived by the thousands, each carrying dreams of wealth and belonging, and finding instead a labyrinth of exploitation, discrimination, and corruption. For many, the American dream quickly turned into the American hustle. Factory jobs paid pennies. Police protection came with a bribe. Politicians made fortunes selling favors. Every system, from City Hall to the corner store, had a price tag. And for men like Charles Luciano, growing up in that environment didn't just teach survival. It taught a truth that would define his life. Real power isn't given, it's taken. The camera moves through the smoky interiors of Tammany Hall, where political bosses brokered deals over whiskey and cigars. Votes were bought, justice was rented, and loyalty was currency. The line between politics and crime was a thread so thin it barely existed. Judges owed favors, cops turned blind eyes, and in that vacuum of law, street gangs flourished. Then came Prohibition, the spark that turned greed into empire. In 1920, when the United States outlawed the sale of alcohol, it didn't stop drinking. It simply moved the bar underground. Across the country, speakeasies glowed behind hidden doors, and bootleggers became overnight millionaires. Whiskey ran like blood through the veins of the nation and corruption followed. Politicians drank the very liquor they banned. Police escorted shipments they were sworn to destroy. And in that chaos, the underworld evolved from small-time racketeering to organized enterprise. Bootlegging syndicates formed across ethnic lines, Italians, Irish and Jews, not out of friendship but out of profit. Money had no accent, and Luciano would soon prove that crime didn't need borders either. Amid this volatile backdrop, America itself was transforming, skyscrapers reaching for the sky while poverty dug its roots deeper below. It was a paradox of ambition and inequality, a place where millionaires and mobsters often shared the same table. The streets of New York weren't just a setting, they were an ecosystem of power, where those who adapted survived and those who hesitated disappeared. The narrator's tone becomes reflective. In a land built on opportunity, corruption wasn't an anomaly, it was the price of ambition. This was the America that raised Lucky Luciano, a country of laws he learned to bend, of systems he learned to exploit. Before he ever built his secret council, he studied this society's greatest weakness, its greed. As the scene fades, we return to the image of the city skyline at night. Beneath the lights, beneath the promise, the foundations of organized crime were already being laid. Luciano didn't invent the system, he perfected it. America had given him all the lessons he needed. He was simply preparing to teach them back, with interest. The stage is set. The nation is corrupt, opportunity is everywhere, and morality is optional. Out of this soil, a street kid named Salvatore Luciano will soon plant the seeds of an empire, not one built on ideology or revenge but on pure, calculated business. The year is 1906. A crowded steamship cuts through the Atlantic fog, carrying hundreds of immigrants toward Ellis Island. Among them is a 9-year-old boy named Salvatore Lucania, small, dark-eyed, curious. He doesn't speak English. He doesn't know what waits for him in New York. But he already carries something rare, a quiet hunger for more than survival. The Lucania family settles in the Lower East Side, a neighborhood bursting with noise, sweat, and struggle. Tenement walls so thin you could hear your neighbor's breath, streets teeming with pushcarts, beggars, and hustlers. Poverty wasn't a shame here, it was a language everyone spoke. For young Salvatore the lesson was clear: to eat you had to fight, to live you had to scheme. School offered little hope. The other boys mocked his accent, his clothes, his Sicilian manners. So he found education elsewhere, in the alleys and corners of Hester Street, where men in sharp suits and wide hats seemed to move with untouchable confidence. They were gangsters, yes, but they were also something more. They were respected, feared, and above all, free. Luciano's first steps into crime were small, running errands for older boys, guarding dice games, collecting protection money. But his instincts were sharp. He wasn't driven by rage or impulse, he was analytical, observant. He learned who to bribe, who to fear, and who to flatter. In a world ruled by chaos, he developed a kind of street diplomacy, one that would later make him indispensable. At 15, he dropped out of school for good and joined the 5 Points Gang, one of New York's most notorious street crews. This was the gangland university of the early 1900s. Its graduates included Al Capone, Johnny Torrio, and Frankie Yale. Here, Luciano learned the unwritten rules. Violence gets attention but control keeps power. The nickname Lucky came later, but not by accident. Some said it came from his uncanny ability to survive, the stabbings, the arrests, the close calls. Others whispered about a brutal beating in 1929 when he was kidnapped, tortured, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. He survived that too, scarred but alive, and from that day the name Lucky stuck like destiny itself. But luck alone wasn't what set him apart. It was his vision. Luciano understood something most gangsters didn't, that crime, like business, needed structure. He watched older mob bosses cling to Sicilian traditions, bound by old grudges and rigid codes. He saw opportunity where they saw taboo. Why limit alliances by ethnicity? Why wage wars when profit could unite? These questions were heresy to the old guard, but to Luciano they were the blueprint of the future. The camera follows him into his 20s, well-dressed now, confident, often seen with his close friends Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Jewish gangsters from Brooklyn who shared his pragmatic philosophy. Together they began something new, an underworld built not on heritage but on partnership. They spoke the universal language of money. The narrator's tone darkened slightly. In a city divided by race, by class, by power, Lucky Luciano built bridges of corruption. His alliances were not born from loyalty, they were forged from need, from vision, from the promise of shared control. By his mid-20s, Luciano was already more businessman than thug. He ran gambling rings, bootlegging operations, and controlled key territories under the shadow of larger bosses like Joe Masuria. But inside he was restless, tired of taking orders, tired of the old men clinging to an outdated code of silence. He wanted something cleaner, bigger, more sustainable. This was not about crime anymore, it was about power with a plan. Every conversation, every favor, every deal was a step toward a single goal: replacing chaos with order. As the section closes, we see him standing on the Manhattan waterfront, looking out over the city skyline. Smoke rising, ships passing, the hum of industry filling the air. To others it's just New York. To Luciano it's territory, a map of opportunity waiting to be divided and controlled. The boy from Sicily had become lucky, not because of chance, but because he had learned how to create his own fortune. And soon that fortune would change the face of organized crime forever. By the mid-1920s, the underworld of New York was a battlefield of tradition and transformation. Two generations of gangsters colliding in a silent war for the soul of organized crime. On one side stood the Mustache Petes, the old Sicilian dons steeped in customs, distrustful of outsiders, and bound by the rituals of the homeland. On the other stood the young bloods, ambitious, Americanized, and tired of bowing to outdated rules. Leading this new generation was Lucky Luciano. To the old dons, Luciano was dangerous not just because of his intelligence, but because of his indifference to their sacred boundaries. He didn't care about bloodlines or villages in Palermo, he cared about efficiency. He saw the mafia not as a cultural brotherhood, but as a business enterprise. For men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two traditionalists who viewed themselves as monarchs, this idea was heresy. But for Luciano it was evolution. The old guard ran their families like feudal kingdoms, secretive, rigid, and territorial. Power passed through lineage and loyalty was blind. Every insult demanded vengeance, every betrayal ended in blood. Business was often secondary to pride. Luciano, however, had grown up in a different world. One shaped by New York capitalism, where alliances changed with profit margins and success depended on adaptability. He respected tradition but only when it served purpose. A cinematic montage follows. Masuria sitting in a restaurant surrounded by bodyguards, chewing on pasta as he plans yet another street war. Luciano in a quiet corner of a nightclub, watching, calculating, saying little. Two philosophies, two worlds. The old dons saw honor in control, Luciano saw control in organization. He began to distance himself from the petty ethnic rivalries that kept the Italian gangs divided. He made alliances that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, with Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Arnold Rothstein, and Irish fixers who could connect him to politicians and police. To the Mustache Petes, these partnerships were betrayal. To Luciano they were strategy. The narrator's tone becomes analytical yet dramatic. Where the old mafia valued blood, Luciano valued balance sheets. Where they saw betrayal, he saw diversification. But breaking from the old order wasn't without danger. Every step he took toward modernization brought new enemies. Masuria, his own boss, was a proud relic of Sicily, a man who demanded tribute, obedience, and total submission. He treated his subordinates like servants, his business partners like pawns. Luciano saw that this kind of leadership was unsustainable. It created resentment, not loyalty. Fear, not respect. In secret conversations with Lansky and Siegel, Luciano began to outline a radical idea: a unified network of criminal families, all independent but operating under a single set of rules, like a board of directors. There would be no supreme king, no tyrant boss, only consensus. Profit would be the new code of honor. It was a business model disguised as a criminal code, and it would change everything. The tension between the old and the new reaches a boiling point. The Castellamarese War looms on the horizon, a violent eruption born from this ideological divide. Luciano knows it's coming. He also knows that to build his new order, he'll have to destroy the old one, and perhaps betray the very men who taught him the game. A quiet scene closes the section. Luciano sits alone at a bar late at night. The band has finished playing. The lights are low. In the reflection of his glass, the audience sees both faces: the young immigrant who fought for a place in this world, and the cold strategist planning to reshape it. The music fades as the narrator delivers the closing line. In the underworld, change doesn't come with votes or revolutions. It comes with blood. And Lucky Luciano was ready to spill it, not out of vengeance but out of vision. The stage is now set for war. A war not just for power but for the future of organized crime itself. The old world is about to burn, and from its ashes, Luciano's new order will rise. The streets of New York in the early 1930s were alive with tension, a city teetering between chaos and control. The Castellamarese War had left its mark, dozens dead, loyalties shattered, and old hierarchies crumbling. But amid the smoke and confusion, one man was already constructing something entirely new. Lucky Luciano wasn't interested in ruling by fear or tradition. He wanted permanence, a criminal structure that could survive its leaders. For Luciano, the war had been more than bloodshed, it had been an education. He had seen firsthand how greed, pride, and superstition destroyed men who refused to evolve. The mafia, he realized, could not afford to keep killing its own. If it wanted to thrive, it needed organization. Not as a clan but as a corporation. He began assembling what he called the syndicate, a network of criminal operations running like a legitimate business empire. His headquarters wasn't a throne room or a hideout. It was a series of hotel suites, restaurants, and offices where deals were discussed as calmly as stock trades. He surrounded himself with minds, not just muscle. Frank Costello, the smooth political fixer, Meyer Lansky, the financial genius, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the fearless enforcer. Each man had a role, each brought a different expertise. Together they were more than criminals, they were strategists. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to merge worlds. He was Italian, but he worked with Jews, Irishmen, and anyone who could produce results. He didn't see ethnicity, he saw assets. The underworld had always been fractured by culture, but Luciano's syndicate transcended that. To him, diversity wasn't weakness, it was strength. By uniting different factions under one cooperative system, he reduced violence and increased profits. The narrator's tone shifts to a measured reverence. He understood what the old dons never could, that crime, like capitalism, depended on structure, communication, and vision. The syndicate had branches across the country, from gambling dens in New York to bootlegging networks in Chicago and Havana. Luciano and Lansky pioneered methods of laundering money through legitimate fronts, restaurants, trucking companies, and even garment factories. Their empire operated with the precision of a multinational company, except its product was vice. To ensure peace, Luciano introduced a revolutionary idea: territory sharing. Rather than fight over turf, the families would divide it like businesses dividing markets. Disputes were handled not by bullets but by meetings. If two parties couldn't agree, Luciano's council would mediate. Violence became a last resort, not a business strategy. He also invested in political insurance. Through Costello's connections, judges were bribed, police captains were paid off, and politicians were quietly supported during elections. The syndicate didn't just control the streets, it infiltrated the system designed to control them. In many ways, they became a shadow government, more efficient and less visible than the one in City Hall. Yet, behind all this success was a layer of calculation that bordered on coldness. Luciano believed in loyalty only as long as it was useful. He rewarded competence and punished recklessness, treating his men not like soldiers but like employees. If someone became a liability, they were removed, efficiently, without drama. His underworld had no room for sentiment. A dramatized sequence captures this duality. Luciano in an elegant hotel suite, negotiating a deal for a nationwide gambling operation, his tone calm, businesslike. Cut to a dark alley the same night, where a disloyal lieutenant is executed, silent, clinical, inevitable. This was Luciano's world, profit on one side, consequence on the other. Under his vision, the mafia became something the old dons never imagined: organized. Territories were mapped. Revenue streams were calculated. Meetings were recorded in ledgers, not whispered over wine. He replaced superstition with structure, vendettas with economics. The underworld had evolved into a system that could outlast any one man, even him. The narrator summarizes the transformation. Luciano turned the mafia from a street gang into an institution. From chaos he built order. From fear he built a future. As the section closes, we see the camera glide over New York's skyline, neon lights flickering, nightclubs humming, police sirens distant. Somewhere in a penthouse suite, Luciano sits with his inner circle, a map of America spread across the table, pins marking cities like Chicago, Cleveland, and Miami. He leans back, cigar smoke curling around him, eyes sharp and calculating. "This," he says quietly, "is how you run a country." The music swells, a tone of inevitability and awe. The transformation is complete. The mafia is no longer a collection of street thugs, it is now a national enterprise. And at its center sits Lucky Luciano, the quiet architect who turned blood into business and crime into an empire. By 1930, the uneasy balance in New York's criminal underworld finally cracked. What had begun as whispered rivalries between two powerful bosses, Joe, the boss Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano, erupted into open warfare. The Castellammarese War wasn't just a fight for power, It was a civil war within the mafia itself, a violent clash between the old world and the new order. And in the middle of it all stood Lucky Luciano, a man caught between loyalty and destiny. The camera opens on the darkened streets of Little Italy. Rain slicks the cobblestones, gunshots echo between brick walls, and newspapers scream headlines of gang murders almost daily. Between 1930 and 1931, bodies pile up, in restaurants, cars, alleys, even barber chairs. It's chaos disguised as honor, bloodshed masquerading as tradition. Masuria, Luciano's current boss, is a symbol of the past, greedy, superstitious, obsessed with old Sicilian codes. He demands tribute from everyone under him and refuses to work with non-Italians, seeing alliances with Jews or Irish as contamination. For him, power means dominance. For Luciano, power means efficiency. And that difference makes them inevitable enemies. On the other side stands Salvatore Maranzano, another Sicilian traditionalist, but more educated and cunning. He arrives from Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily, determined to purify the mafia and claim it as his kingdom. To many of the old guard he's a savior. To the younger generation he's just another tyrant in waiting. Luciano sees both men for what they are, relics of an outdated world. But he's trapped. He can't openly defy Masuria without painting a target on his back, nor can he side with Maranzano without gambling his life. So he does what he does best. He waits, listens, and plays both sides. The narrator's tone sharpens. In a war built on pride, Luciano fought with patience. Where others used guns, he used silence. Behind the scenes, he continues working with his Jewish allies, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, ensuring his income flows even as the old bosses destroy each other. He secretly meets with Maranzano's men, promising neutrality while feeding intelligence to both camps. Every murder, every betrayal, every rumor becomes a tool in his long game. But Luciano knows the war won't end until both Masuria and Maranzano are gone. The blood must be spilled, strategically. In the spring of 1931, Luciano makes his move. He arranges a peace meeting with his boss Joe Masuria at a quiet Coney Island restaurant. It's presented as a reconciliation, but it's really an execution. After sharing lunch and a few hands of cards, Luciano excuses himself to the restroom. Moments later, gunfire erupts. 3 men, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, and Vito Genovese, burst in and shoot Masuria dead. Luciano returns to find his mentor slumped over the table, blood pooling beside his cards. The symbolism is perfect. The old king killed mid-game. The era of Masuria ends with a single deck of cards and a new one begins before his body is even cold. Luciano quickly aligns with Maranzano, who rewards him with control over several lucrative territories. But the alliance is short-lived. Within months, Maranzano reveals his true intentions, to crown himself Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, ruling all mafia families with absolute power. He begins purging rivals and compiling hit lists, Luciano's name among them. Luciano moves first. Using his alliances with Jewish gunmen unfamiliar to Maranzano's Sicilian guards, he orchestrates a daring strike. On September 10, 1931, posing as government agents, 4 men storm Maranzano's Manhattan office and stab him to death. The old world dies with him, violently, decisively. The narrator's tone deepens, almost reverent. With 2 bullets and a blade, Lucky Luciano didn't just end a war. He ended an era. In the aftermath, Luciano calls a meeting of surviving mob leaders. He tells them the age of kings and bosses is over. No more supreme ruler. No more endless vendettas. From now on, the mafia will operate as a federation, with structure, order, and business logic. It's not about bloodlines anymore, it's about profit and partnership. The camera pans across the faces of hardened men sitting around a table, listening to the young Don redefine their world. Outside, New York breathes a rare silence. The war is over. But what rises from its ashes is something far more dangerous. Not chaos, but coordination. Not rebellion, but governance. Luciano has cleared the board. Now he can finally build the system he's been imagining all along. As the section closes, the narrator sums it up. The Castellamarese War began as a feud between Sicilians. It ended as the birth of the American Mafia. The old guard died for their pride. Luciano killed for a purpose. The music swells as the camera drifts upward over the city, the skyline glowing against the night. The blood has dried, but beneath the calm, a new empire breathes. The next chapter isn't about survival anymore. It's about control. And Lucky Luciano is now the man holding the pen that will write its laws. It's 1931. The war is over, the streets are quiet, and the city exhales, but it's not peace. It's reorganization. In the vacuum left by the deaths of Masuria and Maranzano, Lucky Luciano steps forward not as a conqueror, but as an architect. He doesn't want to rule the mafia, he wants to systemize it. The era of the single boss of crowns and oaths is finished. In its place, Luciano envisions something unprecedented, a corporate-style governing body for organized crime. He calls it the Commission. The scene opens with a smoky boardroom inside Manhattan's luxurious Waldorf Astoria hotel. The walls are soundproof, the curtains drawn, the air heavy with cigar smoke and tension. Around a long mahogany table sit the most powerful mob figures in America, men who just months ago were sworn enemies. Luciano presides over them like a chairman of a board meeting. Cool. Calculated. The narrator sets the tone. In a world built on secrecy and blood, Lucky Luciano created democracy, his version of it. Luciano outlines his vision. The mafia, he says, can no longer afford to destroy itself through constant infighting. There will be no more boss of all bosses. Instead, every major family will have a seat at the table. Each family controls its own operations but answers to a national body, the Commission. It will serve as mediator, regulator, and enforcer of order. Disputes will be settled through votes, not vendettas. If war must come, it will come by collective decision, not personal pride. The concept is revolutionary. To men who have lived by the law of vengeance, the idea of voting is almost absurd, but Luciano speaks with such quiet authority that even the old-timers listen. He explains that unity means power, and power means profit. The families can now focus on business, gambling, liquor, unions, and narcotics. The days of street shootouts and reckless ambition are over. The mafia will operate like an invisible corporation, decentralized, efficient, unstoppable. The founding members of the Commission include Luciano himself, his trusted allies Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, and Vito Genovese, and leaders from across the country, Joe Bonanno, Chicago's Al Capone, Buffalo's Stefano Megadino, and others. Together, they represent the new ruling body of organized crime in America. They agree on the basic principles: mutual respect, non-interference in each other's territories, and shared discipline in handling disputes. Luciano's genius isn't just in organization, it's in psychology. He makes everyone feel like they have power while keeping the real control in his hands. He's the quiet mediator, the reasonable voice, but behind the scenes, every major decision still runs through him. He doesn't command loyalty, he engineers it. To maintain peace, the Commission establishes a code of conduct, a set of rules that blend old-world honor with modern pragmatism. No killing without approval. No interfering with another family's business. No drawing law enforcement attention through public violence. These rules aren't about morality, they're about preservation. Luciano knows that the government is always watching, and chaos is bad for business. In one cinematic moment, Luciano stands before the assembled bosses, his tone calm but absolute. From now on, we're not gangs. We're partners. We don't fight for pride, we build for profit. We keep our mouths shut, our hands clean, and our business running. That's the new way. A quiet pause follows. Men exchange looks. Then one by one they nod. With that silent agreement, the Commission is born, not through ceremony but through necessity. The invisible government of the American underworld now has a council. The narrator continues, in that room beneath chandeliers and cigar smoke, the American Mafia was reborn, not as a collection of criminals but as a system. A machine designed to endure. The meeting ends without fanfare. No one raises glasses or makes speeches. They simply rise, shake hands, and disappear back into the city, each man returning to his empire, carrying the weight of a new order. Outside, New York moves on, unaware that within its walls, history has shifted. The impact of the Commission is immediate. Murders drop. Territories stabilize. The families begin cooperating on nationwide operations, pooling money and influence. Profits surge. Luciano's underworld runs smoother than the legitimate government above it. Through this structure, he eliminates chaos, but also eliminates unpredictability. Every boss now answers to something larger than himself, and every dollar, every decision, every betrayal is measured through the lens of collective power. The section ends on a reflective tone. The camera pans over the nighttime skyline of Manhattan, glittering lights over a city unaware of the quiet revolution beneath its streets. The voiceover closes, while Wall Street rebuilt America after the Depression, another boardroom in the shadows rebuilt the underworld. The men in that secret room didn't wear crowns, they wore suits. And with a handshake, Lucky Luciano didn't just unite the mafia. He turned it into a nation within a nation. The music swells softly, blending triumph and menace. The commission is in place, and for the first time in history, the underworld has a government of its own. Luciano stands at its center not as king but as architect, the man who traded bullets for balance sheets and violence for vision. The war was over, and for the first time in decades the underworld was calm, unnervingly calm. But in that silence, something powerful was taking shape. Lucky Luciano's commission had not just ended chaos, it had created opportunity. The mafia was now organized, efficient, and invisible. For Luciano, this was only the beginning. The next phase wasn't about control through fear, it was about building an economy. The narrator sets the scene. Where others saw sin, he saw supply and demand. Where others saw crime, he saw commerce. Luciano's genius lay in transforming vice, the forbidden pleasures of society, into structured industries. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and extortion were no longer reckless rackets run by thugs. They became carefully managed enterprises with books, budgets, and quotas. Every dollar that changed hands in the dark alleys of America was now connected, in some way, to the system he built. Gambling was his most profitable playground. Illegal betting parlors and numbers rackets spread through every borough of New York. Through his alliance with Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, Luciano found ways to legitimize their income. Costello's political connections ensured protection, while Meyer Lansky's mathematical mind kept the money flowing through casinos, horse tracks, and off-the-record betting houses. Together, they built an empire that blurred the line between crime and capitalism. The narrator continues, Luciano didn't invent the vices. He simply industrialized them. But perhaps his boldest move was in prostitution, the world's oldest trade and one of the riskiest. Luciano organized it with ruthless efficiency. He created a city-wide network of brothels, managed by trusted lieutenants, with standardized prices, protection systems, and profit sharing. Women were moved between locations to avoid detection, and clients included politicians, businessmen, and celebrities. Luciano called it the combination, a coordinated enterprise designed to eliminate competition and maximize revenue. Yet even here, his reasoning was cold and practical. He saw prostitution not as a moral sin, but as a commodity that people would always demand. To him, refusing to profit from it made less sense than condemning alcohol during Prohibition. In his mind, he wasn't corrupting society, he was simply monetizing its hypocrisy. Beyond New York, Luciano's influence spread like an economic wave. The commission established partnerships with Midwest and West Coast mobs, opening revenue channels across the country. The mafia now controlled everything from liquor imports to dock operations and labor unions. The underworld became an invisible partner in America's industrial boom. Trucking companies, construction firms, and entertainment venues all paid a tax to operate peacefully. One of Luciano's most sophisticated innovations was the manipulation of unions. Through Costello's political connections and Vito Genovese's muscle, the mafia infiltrated the Teamsters, the Longshoremen's Union, and other labor organizations. They didn't just shake them down for money, they owned them. Controlling labor meant controlling entire industries. If a company refused to cooperate, a strike appeared the next day. If it complied, business ran smoothly. It was extortion disguised as influence. A cinematic montage plays, ships unloading at New York docks under watchful eyes. Casino lights flickering in Havana. Envelopes of cash passing hands in backrooms. And Luciano, impeccably dressed, calm, always one step removed, watching it all unfold from behind the curtain. To keep the empire running, he insisted on structure. Each family had specific roles, territories, and profit divisions. He treated meetings like corporate briefings, concise, data-driven, and emotionless. He enforced discipline through logic, not theatrics. Killing, in his system, was no longer a statement of power, it was a managerial decision, an act of efficiency. The narrator's tone turns reflective. Lucky Luciano didn't just professionalize crime, he rationalized it. He gave sin a spreadsheet, vice a balance sheet, and power a business plan. But behind the smooth operations there was always danger. The greater the structure, the more visible the empire became. Police and politicians began to whisper about a superorganization running the nation's criminal economy. Newspapers hinted at an unseen board of directors of crime. Luciano ignored the noise. As long as the money kept flowing and the streets stayed quiet, he believed he was untouchable. For the moment he was right. New York had never been more stable. The families coexisted in relative peace, their profits secure, their disputes rare. Luciano's system worked too well. The section ends with a quiet, almost cinematic reflection. In a dimly lit penthouse, Luciano pours himself a drink and looks out over the glittering lights of Manhattan. The city hums beneath him, its theaters, casinos, and clubs all part of his machine. He has achieved what no gangster before him ever had: control without chaos. The voiceover concludes, he had turned crime into capitalism, vice into industry, and the mafia into a nation built on the promise of profit. But power that's smooth, that's silent, has a way of attracting attention, the kind that no one can buy off. The final image lingers on Luciano's face, calm, composed, confident, as the camera slowly pulls back through the window into the night sky. The empire glows below like circuitry, efficient, electric, and utterly dependent on the man who built it. The system is perfect, for now. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire was running like a clock, precise, profitable, untouchable. The commission kept the families in check, the money flowed from coast to coast, and the police seemed perpetually one step behind. To most of America, Luciano was invisible, his name whispered only in smoky backrooms or buried in coded ledgers. But beneath the polished calm, a storm was building, one that would come not from rival gangsters, but from a crusader determined to drag the mafia into the light. The scene opens with a contrast. Manhattan glitters under neon light, nightclubs, laughter, champagne. Then the camera cuts to a stark office in downtown New York. No smoke, no glamour, only files, photographs, and determination. Behind a desk stacked with case folders sits a young, ambitious prosecutor, Thomas E. Dewey. His eyes are sharp, his voice clipped. He has one goal: to dismantle the criminal empire that everyone says doesn't exist. The narrator's voice sets the tone. While Lucky Luciano built his power in the shadows, Thomas Dewey built his in daylight. One ruled through silence, the other through publicity. The collision was inevitable. Dewey had something the mob never expected: public trust. He was America's new kind of hero, clean-cut, incorruptible, and relentless. His crusade began with smaller rackets, bootleggers, pimps, and gambling operators, but it didn't take long for his investigators to notice a pattern. Every operation, no matter how minor, seemed to lead back to the same invisible network. The money trail always curved toward the same unseen figure, Luciano. For the first time, the mafia's carefully concealed structure was being mapped, not by informants but by economics. Dewey's team followed the cash, the coded banknotes, the donations to union funds and political campaigns. They discovered Luciano's fingerprints everywhere, even when he never touched the money himself. But Dewey's problem was proof. Luciano was too smart to be caught in the act. He didn't write, didn't sign, didn't even speak openly. His empire operated on whispers and nods. To bring him down, Dewey needed a witness, someone inside the system. That's when the first cracks began to show. The same efficiency that made Luciano's empire powerful also made it fragile. Every link in his chain depended on silence. When one broke, the entire system trembled. In 1935, law enforcement raided a series of brothels in Manhattan and Brooklyn, all connected, all organized, all suspiciously disciplined. The prostitutes and madams arrested spoke of protection, payments, and higher-ups. None dared name Luciano directly, until one woman did. Her name was Cokie Flo Brown, a madam and heroin addict with nothing left to lose. She claimed that every major brothel in New York paid tribute to Lucky Luciano's men. It was the thread Dewey needed, and he pulled hard. Soon, others followed. Dancers, pimps, and middlemen who, under pressure, confirmed that Luciano's network controlled prostitution across the city. The narrator lowers the tone. The empire that had thrived in silence was now bleeding words. Meanwhile, within the mafia itself, paranoia spread. Luciano's allies began to question whether the commission's stability could survive this kind of heat. Frank Costello urged discretion. Vito Genovese, ambitious and cunning, whispered that perhaps Luciano's reign had attracted too much attention. Old allies became cautious, their loyalty measured against survival. Luciano remained calm, outwardly unaffected. He saw Dewey's crusade as political theater, another publicity stunt. Let him make headlines, he supposedly told Costello. He's chasing ghosts. But as the arrests piled up and the newspapers printed Luciano's name in bold type, the illusion of invisibility began to crack. In a cinematic montage, we see detectives tailing mob couriers through the crowded streets, tapping phones, recording whispered deals. Dewey's men raid offices and clubs, gathering ledgers, coded notes, and testimonies. Slowly, methodically, they build a case, not against the violence of the mafia but against its organization. It was the first time law enforcement treated the underworld not as a collection of thugs, but as a corporation. Dewey understood that Luciano's power didn't come from his gunmen, it came from his system. And if he could prove that system existed, the myth of the untouchable Don would shatter. Luciano, sensing danger, made a rare mistake: he underestimated the enemy. He assumed his influence within the police and courts was enough to shield him. But Dewey wasn't corruptible. His investigation was public, his ambition political, his reputation tied to victory. For Dewey, taking down Luciano wasn't just justice, it was destiny. The pressure mounts. Luciano's men are followed, questioned, arrested. Newspapers paint him as the king of vice. Politicians demand action. What had once been a shadow empire now stood under a burning spotlight. Luciano orders meetings, silences loose tongues, moves money offshore, but the machinery of law is already grinding forward. The narrator's voice darkens. For years, Luciano had run his empire from the dark. But the brighter the world around him became, the shorter his shadow grew. The section closes on a tense, cinematic image. Luciano standing at a window overlooking Times Square, watching the electric billboards flash Dewey's name across the skyline. Behind him, the city buzzes with life. His city, his empire. Yet for the first time he feels it slipping beyond his control. The voiceover ends on a quiet note. He had built an empire no bullet could destroy. But in the end it wouldn't be the gun that brought him down, it would be the light. Fade to black. The war between two kinds of power, shadow and spotlight, has begun. Spring 1936. New York City hums with the pulse of a new era, jazz, headlines and ambition. But beneath the glitter, tension coils tight. The newspapers are filled with stories of vice raids, prostitution rings, and the shadow empire of Lucky Luciano. His name, once whispered in the darkness of backrooms, is now splashed across front pages in bold ink. The invisible man of crime has become America's most wanted symbol of corruption. The camera opens with a slow zoom on a courthouse. Men in fedoras crowding the steps, flashbulbs exploding like gunfire. Reporters shout questions, police officers push through the crowd, and at the center of the chaos, the man who once ruled the underworld steps out of a black sedan, perfectly dressed, calm as ever, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. The narrator's voice cuts through the noise, low and measured. He built his empire in silence. But in the end it was the sound of cameras, not gunfire, that marked his downfall. Thomas Dewey's investigation had reached its peak. After months of raids, interrogations and quiet deals with terrified witnesses, the unthinkable happened. A grand jury issued an indictment against Luciano on 90 counts of compulsory prostitution. Dewey's argument was simple but devastating. Luciano didn't just profit from vice, he ran it like a business. The evidence wasn't about blood or violence, it was about organization. The arrest came in dramatic fashion. Luciano had fled New York to avoid the media circus, hiding in Hot Springs, Arkansas, a quiet town known for its friendly law enforcement. For a while he thought he was safe, shielded by his network of bribes and political contacts. But Dewey had outmaneuvered him. Through interstate cooperation, a rare achievement for the time, the young prosecutor arranged for Luciano's capture and extradition. In one cinematic scene U.S. Marshals burst into a hotel suite in Hot Springs. Luciano looks up from his breakfast, unshaken. "What's the charge?" he asks, almost amused. When they tell him, prostitution, he laughs softly. "You've got the wrong guy," he says. But as he's handcuffed and led out past reporters, that confidence begins to crack. For the first time in years, Lucky Luciano is no longer in control. The trial that followed was a spectacle, the first of its kind. Dewey understood the theater of justice and he used it masterfully. Every day, reporters filled the courtroom, sketching Luciano's calm expression, his expensive suits, his detached demeanor. The prosecution paraded a series of witnesses, prostitutes, madams and pimps, who testified that Luciano's lieutenants collected money, set prices and enforced rules. Among the witnesses was Cokie Flo Brown, whose earlier testimony had set the case in motion. She described meetings, payoffs and coded language. Her words painted a picture of an empire that operated with military precision. The defense tried to discredit her, pointing to her drug addiction and criminal record. But Dewey wasn't relying on her alone. He had dozens of corroborating accounts, phone records and ledger entries that connected the dots. Luciano's lawyer argued passionately that his client had no involvement, that he was being framed for political ambition. But the jury wasn't convinced. They saw the polished man in the suit not as a victim, but as the mastermind behind the filth of the city's underworld. The narrator's tone turns introspective. For years he had built a kingdom without walls, a network invisible to the naked eye. But now, every hidden wire, every whispered order, every secret dollar was being dragged into the light. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Some saw Luciano as a monster, others as a modern Robin Hood, the immigrant who played by America's own corrupted rules and won. Yet inside the courtroom his fate was already sealed. Dewey's closing argument was a masterpiece of rhetoric. Crime, when organized, is more dangerous than war. It does not fight for a nation. It fights for profit. And when men like Lucky Luciano rise unchecked, they do not just steal money, they steal morality. The jury deliberated for less than 24 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted, cameras flashing, spectators gasping. Luciano remained stone-faced, unmoving as the judge pronounced his sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison. The man who once ruled New York's criminal world, who controlled rackets from Havana to Chicago, was now being led away in handcuffs, surrounded by guards, his empire collapsing behind him. The narrator's voice deepens. In that moment, the myth of invincibility died. The man who had built the modern mafia now faced the one thing he couldn't bribe, threaten, or outthink: time. As he was escorted down the courthouse steps, reporters shouted questions. "Any last words, Lucky?" one yelled. Luciano paused, looked up, and gave a faint smile. "Tell Dewey he did a good job," he said quietly. Then he disappeared into the waiting van. The trial wasn't just a legal victory, it was a cultural one. For the first time, the American public saw organized crime as a system, not just scattered gangs. Dewey became a national hero, and his success launched him toward political stardom. The mafia, meanwhile, was forced to adapt. With its architect behind bars, cracks began to form within the commission. The section closes on a somber note. The camera pans over Sing Sing prison, gray stone walls rising over the Hudson River, the faint sound of metal doors clanging shut. Inside, in a dimly lit cell, Luciano sits at a small desk, cigarette smoke curling into the air. He stares at a newspaper headline, "Lucky Luciano Convicted." The corners of his mouth lift in a faint, ironic smile. The narrator whispers the final line: he had built a kingdom on silence. But when the silence broke, it wasn't the streets that condemned him, it was history. Fade to black. The empire is in ruins, but the story of Lucky Luciano is far from over. Behind bars, his power is wounded, not dead. The underworld still waits for his signal. The steel doors slam shut with a thunderous echo. The echo rolls through the cold hallways of Clinton Correctional Facility, up the stone walls, and into the history of organized crime. It's 1936. Charles Lucky Luciano, once the most powerful man in the American underworld, is now inmate 92168. The king of crime has traded his tailored suits for prison blues. The man who once commanded cities now answers to guards. But if anyone believed this was the end of Lucky Luciano, they didn't understand him at all. The narrator's voice begins slowly, almost contemplative. Power isn't a place. It's a mindset. And for Luciano, a prison cell wasn't confinement, it was simply a new office. At first, Luciano played the part of the model prisoner. He kept quiet, followed orders, and maintained an aura of calm that unsettled both guards and inmates. But beneath the surface he was adapting, studying the system the same way he once studied the streets. Within months, he had turned the rigid hierarchy of prison life into a miniature version of the underworld. Using intermediaries and visitors, Luciano continued to send coded messages to his allies on the outside. The commission, though shaken by his arrest, still recognized him as the ultimate authority. Frank Costello handled political contacts. Albert Anastasia managed enforcement. And in Luciano's absence, Vito Genovese, ever ambitious, began maneuvering for more control. But even from behind bars, Lucky's influence remained absolute. No major decision was made without his word. The camera pans across the prison yard, men in gray uniforms walking in slow circles, guards watching from towers. Then it cuts to Luciano sitting on a bench, speaking quietly to a fellow inmate. To the casual observer, it's a mundane conversation. But to those who know, it's policy being made, deals being arranged, orders being relayed. The narrator continues, even stripped of his freedom, Luciano understood something deeper than control. He understood continuity. As long as the structure survived, so did he. Through smuggled letters and carefully orchestrated visits, Luciano maintained his empire's flow. He learned to communicate through the language of loyalty, subtle shifts in wording, coded greetings, and intermediaries who acted as living messages. A simple phrase spoken in the visiting room could shift millions of dollars or decide the fate of a rival. Meanwhile, life behind bars began to reshape him. The isolation brought reflection. He began reading voraciously, history, economics, psychology. He studied legitimate corporations, comparing their operations to his own underworld design. To fellow inmates, he often spoke about power in abstract terms, how it moved, how it disguised itself, how it survived pressure. He once told a cellmate, "You can't kill power. You can only redirect it." Outside the walls, America was changing. The Great Depression was ending and World War II loomed on the horizon. As soldiers shipped off to Europe, the docks of New York became critical for the war effort. But there was a problem. Rumors spread of Axis sympathizers and sabotage threats along the waterfront, docks that, ironically, were under mafia control. And this is where Luciano's imprisonment took a strange, almost unbelievable turn. In 1942, the U.S. Navy faced a crisis. The ship Normandy, one of the largest troop transports, caught fire and capsized while docked in New York Harbor. The incident fueled fears of Nazi sabotage. Desperate to protect the docks, naval intelligence made an extraordinary decision. They reached out to Lucky Luciano. The narrator's tone sharpens. In the middle of a world war, the U.S. government turned to a convicted mob boss for help. Through intermediaries, primarily Meyer Lansky, the Navy negotiated a secret deal. In exchange for Luciano's cooperation in securing the docks and providing intelligence on Axis activities in Sicily, his prison conditions would be eased, and his eventual parole considered. The operation was codenamed Operation Underworld. It was a marriage of necessity and irony, the American government relying on the same criminal networks it had sworn to destroy. And it worked. Luciano used his influence through Costello and other mob leaders to ensure that the docks remained secure. No further sabotage occurred, and ships moved freely under mafia protection. The camera shifts to a dimly lit meeting room inside the prison, where a Navy officer and a warden quietly discuss arrangements. A guard unlocks a door and Luciano steps out, expression unreadable. For the first time since his conviction, he's not being interrogated, he's being consulted. The narrator reflects. He was a prisoner in theory, but in practice he was indispensable. The government called him a criminal, the war called him a strategist. After the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, Luciano's connections once again proved useful. He had deep ties to Sicilian figures who provided intelligence on local conditions, helping smooth the invasion. Reports later credited his assistance, discreetly, with saving lives and accelerating operations. By 1945, as the war drew to an end, Luciano's image began to shift. To his men he was a martyr. To some in the government, an asset. To the public, a paradox. A criminal who had somehow served his country. In 1946, after nearly a decade behind bars, the deal's quiet promises bore fruit. New York's governor, Thomas Dewey, the same man who once prosecuted him, commuted Luciano's sentence in recognition of his wartime assistance. But there was a catch. Luciano would be deported to Italy. Before his release, Luciano spent his final days in prison reflecting on what he'd built and lost. He knew he'd never walk New York streets again. Yet, as he told one confidant, "They can send me anywhere. My name stays here." The section closes on a haunting image. Luciano walking through the prison gates for the last time, a cold wind blowing across his face. Behind him, the gray walls of Clinton fade into the distance. Ahead lies exile and uncertainty. The narrator's voice softens to a whisper. He entered prison as a king in chains and left it as a myth. Even the walls that caged him couldn't contain his legend. Lucky Luciano had lost his freedom, but not his power. Fade out. The stage is set for the final act. Exile, redemption, and the slow unraveling of the man who once ran America from the shadows. February 1946. A gray winter sky hangs over Ellis Island as a ship prepares to leave New York Harbor. Standing at the railing, wearing a dark overcoat and fedora, Charles Lucky Luciano stares at the city he once ruled. The skyline is a blur behind the fog. The towers, the lights, the empire he built from nothing. He is leaving not as a free man, but as a ghost of his own legend. The narrator's voice, soft yet deliberate, begins. He had conquered America's underworld, commanded its fortunes and rewritten the rules of power. But now, Lucky Luciano was being sent home, to a country that was no longer his, and a world that no longer needed him. The ship sets sail. Luciano's deportation marks the official end of an era. After 9 years in prison, he is expelled from the United States and sent back to Italy, a country he had not seen since he was a child. To the American press, it's poetic justice. To the mafia, it's an exile with consequences. When Luciano arrives in Naples, crowds of reporters swarm the docks. Flashbulbs burst. "Do you plan to return to America?" they shout. Luciano just smirks and says, "I never left." That answer becomes symbolic, because even in exile, his reach still stretches across the ocean. He settles in a villa near Naples where he lives quietly, at least on the surface. But beneath the calm, Luciano is already rebuilding. Old allies like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky remain loyal. Through coded letters, trusted couriers, and intermediaries, Luciano continues to advise the American mafia. The commission still considers him its spiritual head, even if he can no longer attend the meetings he once ruled. The narrator explains, exile didn't silence him. It elevated him. From afar, Luciano became a myth, the invisible hand that still guided the American underworld. In Italy, Luciano begins networking with local figures, smugglers, politicians, and remnants of the Sicilian mafia. Post-war Europe is in chaos and opportunity is everywhere. Black markets thrive and Luciano sees a new empire rising, this time built not on gambling or prostitution but on heroin. Working through connections in Marseille and Sicily, he helps establish the infamous French Connection, a narcotics pipeline that would dominate global drug trafficking for decades. Morphine base from Turkey and the Middle East is refined in France, then shipped to the United States through networks Luciano helped organize. The profits are staggering. But it isn't just about money anymore. For Luciano, it's about legacy. He wants to prove that even from exile he is indispensable, the architect behind every modern form of organized crime. Yet, as years pass, the world changes faster than he can control it. The new generation of mobsters, men like Carlo Gambino and Joe Bonanno, respect him but they no longer fear him. They are businessmen now, molded by his philosophy but not bound by his authority. The camera cuts to a quiet cafe in Naples. Luciano sits alone at a table, older now, his face lined with years and regrets. He watches young men laugh, smoke, and talk about money. Their ambition reminds him of himself. But he knows the truth: power never stays in one place for long. The narrator's voice turns reflective. He had created the system that made him obsolete. In making crime a business, he taught the next generation to outgrow its king. Still, Luciano refuses to fade away. In 1947, he secretly meets with Lansky and other associates in Havana, Cuba. The island, rich with casinos, political corruption, and American tourism, is the perfect neutral ground for business. There, he plans to reassert his influence and unify old connections under one global network. The Havana Conference becomes legendary, an echo of the old commission meetings, attended by figures like Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, and the rising Chicago bosses. Luciano appears in public, shaking hands, smiling for photographs, his presence alone enough to command respect. For a brief moment, it feels as if the king has returned. But America hasn't forgotten him. When U.S. newspapers publish photos of Luciano in Havana, outrage explodes. Under pressure from Washington, Cuban authorities arrest and deport him back to Italy. The message is clear: he will never rule again. After that, Luciano's life becomes quieter, lonelier. The old glamour is gone. The world has moved on to new wars, new leaders, new rules. He remains under constant surveillance by Italian and American intelligence, his phone tapped, his every visitor monitored. He walks the streets of Naples like a retired general, respected, feared, but irrelevant. Occasionally, reporters find him. "Do you regret your past?" they ask. He smiles faintly and says, "Regret? No. I did what I had to do. I made something out of nothing. That's the American way, isn't it?" But beneath that smirk lies weariness. Friends die. Alliances dissolve. The system he built, the commission, the codes, the silent order, becomes corrupted by greed and chaos. The very balance he once maintained begins to crumble in the coming decades of mafia wars. Luciano sees it all from afar, powerless to intervene. The narrator's voice slows. He had once ruled through silence, fear, and intelligence. But now, silence was all that remained. January 26, 1962. Naples Airport. Luciano, now 64, stands waiting for a visitor, a film producer from Rome who plans to make a movie about his life. He straightens his tie, lights a cigarette, and rehearses his answers in his head. Then suddenly he clutches his chest. The cigarette drops from his hand. He collapses to the ground. When the paramedics arrive, it's too late. Lucky Luciano, the man who built the American mafia, who ruled from boardrooms and prison cells alike, is dead of a heart attack. As the camera pans over the crowd gathered around his body, the narrator speaks softly. After a lifetime of bullets, betrayals, and blood, it wasn't violence that ended him. It was time. His funeral in Naples is small but dignified. A handful of old friends, a few journalists, and curious onlookers. In America, news of his death spreads through the underworld like a quiet whisper. Some raise a glass. Some bow their heads. Every boss, every family, every soldier knows, whether they admit it or not, that everything they are, everything they control began with him. The closing image is of Luciano's grave, sunlight cutting through the Italian cypress trees. The narrator concludes, he began as a poor Sicilian boy chasing survival. He became the architect of an empire built on loyalty, silence, and vision. And though they exiled his body, his blueprint stayed behind, written into every shadowed deal, every whispered oath, every act of power that followed. The camera fades to black. Lucky Luciano, the king without a kingdom, is gone. But his empire, his philosophy, his system still breathe through the world he left behind. The wind rolls gently across the cemetery in Naples. The marble stone reads simply, Salvatore Lucania, 1897–1962. There are no flowers, no fanfare, no crowds. Just silence, the kind that follows a storm long after it's passed. And yet, in that silence, his name still travels continents. Not whispered in fear anymore but in fascination. Because Lucky Luciano didn't just die a man. He died an idea. He left behind no company, no written legacy, no heirs. But what he built, the structure of modern organized crime, endures in every dark corner of power, in every invisible deal that shapes the world. From the shadows of Wall Street to the alleys of Palermo, his vision still hums beneath the noise of modern civilization. The narrator's tone turns deliberate, reflective, almost reverent. Luciano didn't invent organized crime. He organized it. He gave chaos a constitution, and the underworld a government. When he first proposed the commission in the early 1930s, the idea was revolutionary. 7 families from across America, each sovereign yet bound by law, governed not by emotion but by profit. They had voting rights, territory, structure, even arbitration. It was a democracy of criminals, a congress of shadows. And it worked. For decades it kept the peace. It turned assassins into administrators, gunmen into businessmen. Luciano's organizational genius allowed the mafia to flourish like never before. No more street wars, no more random killings that brought police scrutiny. Everything was regulated, the way a corporation regulates its departments. The narrator continues, the imagery crisp and measured. He had replaced the knife with the contract, the vendetta with the handshake, and the code of silence with the language of business. By the time of his death, Luciano's blueprint had been exported far beyond New York. In Chicago, in Detroit, in Kansas City, the families adopted his structure. Even the Sicilian mafia, older and more secretive, began modernizing its operations under his influence. In the 1950s and 60s, as America's mafia expanded into unions, construction, and narcotics, the architecture of those empires traced back to one mind, his. And it wasn't just criminals who learned from him. Government agencies began studying his methods. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, initially refused to acknowledge the existence of the mafia, but when the Appalachian meeting of 1957 exposed dozens of mob bosses in one place, they realized they were looking at a system, not a series of gangs. A Luciano system. Charts, family trees, and hierarchy diagrams filled FBI offices. The same structure Luciano had created decades before. He had effectively taught law enforcement how to understand organized crime. Ironically, the very system that made him powerful also made him traceable. But beyond crime, Luciano's legacy was philosophical. He changed the meaning of power. He understood it not as brute force but as influence, the ability to make others act in your interest without them realizing it. That was his true genius. He bridged 2 worlds, the brutal street codes of old Sicily and the capitalist ethos of America. A cinematic montage plays, archival footage of Manhattan's skyline in the 1930s, bustling with energy, the docks filled with goods, the nightclubs alive with jazz and illegal whiskey. Luciano's world was violent, yes, but it was also visionary. He saw what few did, that America itself was an enterprise and crime was just another form of entrepreneurship. He wasn't the first to bribe a politician or fix a union vote. But he was the first to see corruption as a systemic tool, not as a weakness but as an extension of governance. He understood the transactional nature of democracy in a capitalist society. Money bought silence. Influence bought freedom. And silence, above all, bought longevity. The narrator pauses, the tone softening. Luciano didn't just master corruption. He redefined it, made it efficient, sustainable, and almost invisible. Even after his exile, his system evolved. The 5 families he structured, Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, became institutions. Each had territories, hierarchies, accountants, lawyers. By the 1970s, their profits surpassed major corporations. They controlled construction contracts, garbage hauling, garment districts, and even portions of the film industry. Luciano's dream of a boardroom underworld had come true. But as with all empires, success bred complacency. His successors inherited his order but lost his restraint. They chased greed without discipline, violence without vision. Men like John Gotti, flamboyant, reckless, headline-seeking, broke the sacred rule of silence that Luciano had built his empire upon. And slowly, the system began to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. The narrator's tone darkens. Luciano built an empire on invisibility. But his children wanted fame. And fame is fatal in the underworld. Yet even in decline, the mafia continued to shape modern society, not through fear but through its imitation. Corporations borrowed its loyalty systems. Political machines mirrored its patronage networks. Even tech startups, in their hierarchies and secrecy, echo his principles. Control information, reward loyalty, eliminate weakness. In this sense, Lucky Luciano's real legacy isn't confined to crime. It's cultural. It's psychological. He taught that success, legal or illegal, depends on structure, secrecy, and relationships. He proved that any system can be tamed if you understand how people think, what they fear, and what they desire. The camera shifts to modern New York. Bright lights, digital billboards, endless traffic. The world has changed, but the game hasn't. Deals are still made in private. Influence still flows through hidden channels. Power is still negotiated, never given. Luciano's DNA runs through it all. Then the narrator draws the connection forward. From Wall Street mergers to political lobbying, from shadow governments to transnational cartels. Every network that thrives in secrecy owes a debt to Lucky Luciano. He was the first to turn the ancient art of conspiracy into an organizational science. Still, history is not kind to its architects. His empire, once built on balance, became consumed by greed. The commission turned into a theater of paranoia. Informants, betrayals, and wiretaps tore apart the structure he had made unbreakable. By the late 20th century, prosecutors like Rudy Giuliani used the RICO Act, ironically, a legal mirror of Luciano's organizational model, to dismantle the mafia from the top down. And yet, even as the courts broke the bodies of the 5 families, the spirit of their founder remained untouchable. Because Luciano never represented crime alone. He represented order within crime. His genius was in giving even lawlessness a set of rules. The narrator's tone grows reflective, almost poetic. He was a contradiction made flesh, ruthless but rational, criminal but visionary. He believed in profit over passion, logic over loyalty. And in doing so, he created something that outlived every bullet fired in his name. In death, Luciano became myth. Films, novels, and documentaries turned him into both villain and philosopher, the Machiavelli of Manhattan. From The Godfather to Boardwalk Empire, his shadow defines the archetype of the American mobster, calm, calculating, and charismatic. To many, he's the devil who corrupted America. To others, he's the immigrant who mastered it. Both are true. Because Lucky Luciano's real crime wasn't running a criminal empire, it was understanding America too well. He saw that capitalism and crime shared the same skeleton: ambition, secrecy, and power. He simply refused to pretend there was a difference. The narrator's final reflection over quiet music. In the end, his name became more than history. It became language, shorthand for power without morality, control without conscience. But also for brilliance without opportunity, and for a man who rose from nothing to command everything. As the screen fades to black, we're left with a truth that outlives him. Luciano didn't just build the mafia. He built the modern idea of the underworld, and, in a way, the modern idea of power itself. His grave may rest in Naples. But his empire, unseen, evolving, eternal, lives wherever ambition learns to hide in the dark. Night falls over New York City. The skyline burns gold against a curtain of darkness, a living monument to ambition, money, and movement. From the East River to Harlem, the city hums like a machine, relentless, beautiful, and dangerous. The same machine Lucky Luciano once controlled, not through bullets but through balance, through order, through vision. The camera glides over Manhattan's lights, shimmering like a constellation of power. The narrator's voice enters, calm and deliberate. In the city that never sleeps, power never dies. It only changes hands. This is where the story ends, and where it never really ends. Because Lucky Luciano didn't just live in history, he engineered it. He left behind no statue, no plaque, no legacy of speeches or laws. And yet, his fingerprints are everywhere, in every backroom deal, in every handshake that means more than it says, in every empire built on loyalty and silence. He was the invisible architect of the American underworld, but his true genius lay in something greater. Understanding that the underworld and the overworld were never separate. They were mirrors, reflections of the same human hunger dressed in different clothes. The narrator's tone deepens. Luciano didn't just build a criminal empire. He built a philosophy, that power, like business, could be structured, negotiated, and managed. That chaos could be turned into order. The screen cuts to black and white footage. New York's crowded Lower East Side in the early 1900s. Pushcarts, smoke, poverty. A young boy named Salvatore Lucania walks through it, eyes sharp, face hungry. The world around him offers no mercy, only lessons. And he learns them all. He learns that respect is not given, it's taken. That fear is a currency. That every man, no matter how righteous, has a price. And he learns that the greatest crime of all is not breaking the law, it's failing to understand the game. As the music swells, the narration continues. He was not born lucky. He became lucky because he made his own odds. The camera dissolves into the image of Luciano in his prime. Tailored suit, eyes calm but alive, cigarette in hand. The face of a man who doesn't need to shout. A man who built an empire of silence. For decades he was both feared and respected, a paradox in human form. The same man who could order a hit before breakfast could spend the afternoon discussing profit margins. To his associates he was not just a boss, he was an institution. But the tragedy of power is that it consumes everything it touches. The same clarity that built his empire also blinded him to its limits. He believed he could control the chaos forever. That structure was stronger than betrayal. That fear could hold loyalty in place. But fear always cracks, and when it does, everything built on it begins to crumble. The screen flashes through the stages of his downfall, the courtroom, the headlines, the chains. The camera lingers on his face during the trial, composed, unreadable. The narrator murmurs, "In that moment, Luciano learned the final rule of power. It can never truly be owned, only borrowed." Even behind bars his legend grew. Newspapers turned him into a symbol, the criminal mastermind, the man who ran America from his cell. To law enforcement he was proof that no one was untouchable. To his followers he was proof that power could survive even in captivity. He adapted again. He learned to rule through whispers instead of orders, through messages instead of meetings. He turned prison into his office. He was still the chairman, of a system too vast to be broken by a single man's confinement. But time, unlike men, cannot be bribed. The world outside his prison changed. New bosses rose, new wars began. The golden age of the mafia gave way to greed, drugs, and violence beyond his control. His methodical system of business gave way to impulsive brutality. The empire he had built on reason began to rot from within. When he was deported to Italy, it wasn't just a punishment, it was exile from the world he had created. A king without a kingdom. The narration softens as the camera pans over Naples, the old city, the sea glimmering in twilight. Luciano walks these streets now, a legend in retirement. The locals whisper his name, half in fear, half in reverence. He's older, slower, but the fire in his eyes never dies. He had once ruled New York from the shadows, the narrator says. Now he was a ghost haunting his own creation. In his final years, Luciano became something unexpected, reflective. He spoke often about fate, about the choices that led him here. In private moments, he admitted that maybe his greatest victory was also his greatest mistake, bringing order to a world that was never meant to have it. He saw what his structure became after him, greedier, bloodier, less disciplined. The commission he built to prevent wars had instead given rise to men who sought only chaos. He had built a machine but not the conscience to sustain it. The narrator's voice grows softer, introspective. He created a world that could outlive him, and that was the problem. Because in the end, power doesn't remember its creator. It only remembers itself. And yet, for all his contradictions, Luciano never saw himself as evil. He once told a reporter, "All I ever wanted was to make crime organized. Without all the killing. Without the mess." There's a tragic honesty in that. He was a criminal who wanted order, a visionary trapped in a corrupt era, a man who tried to make sense of human greed, and got lost in it. The final footage slows. Luciano walks down a pier in Naples, cigarette in hand. The wind catches his coat. He looks out at the horizon, calm, solitary. This is not the swaggering king of New York anymore. This is the philosopher of the underworld, facing his final sunset. The narrator continues, "When the heart attack came, it was sudden. No drama. No betrayal. Just silence. The same silence he once commanded." The scene fades to black and white. Paramedics rush to his side. The camera lingers not on the death itself, but on the stillness that follows. The way time seems to hold its breath, as if even the universe pauses to acknowledge a closing chapter. He died in 1962, far from the city that made him, surrounded not by his men but by strangers. And yet, in that moment he belonged to history in a way he never did in life. The narrator's tone turns reverent. Lucky Luciano never wanted to be remembered as a killer. He wanted to be remembered as a builder. And in a way he was both. A montage follows. The roaring streets of 1930s New York. The commission meetings and smoky rooms. The raids, the trials, the betrayals. The old men in exile watching their empires fade. Over it the narrator reflects, he built a new kind of power, corporate, efficient and cold. He turned the mafia from a tribal relic into a multinational enterprise. He made crime modern. And that is his legacy, for better or worse. As the music deepens, the narration shifts toward philosophy. Luciano's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the line between crime and capitalism has always been thin. Both rely on control, both thrive on hierarchy, both are driven by the same human instincts: ambition, loyalty, and fear. In many ways, his empire was a mirror of the world above it, Wall Street with guns. He understood people better than most psychologists. He knew that loyalty could be engineered, that fear could be managed, that ambition could be monetized. His genius was not in crime itself, but in organization, in understanding that people don't follow morality, they follow momentum. That's why his methods outlived him. His legacy didn't just shape organized crime, it shaped modern thinking about power itself. Corporations, cartels, and even political machines use his principles: structure, silence, and shared profit. The narrator pauses, almost whispering, "Perhaps the greatest trick Luciano ever pulled was convincing the world that he was just a gangster, when in truth he was a strategist of human nature." The music softens. The cityscape of modern Manhattan appears, glittering, alive. The same streets, the same skyline, but now filled with glass towers instead of speakeasies. Yet the game remains. Deals still happen in private rooms. Loyalties still shift behind closed doors. The faces change, the methods evolve, but the system persists. Luciano's true legacy, the narrator says, isn't in the crimes he committed. It's in the system he inspired. A system that taught the world that control is the purest form of power. As the documentary approaches its end, the tone turns reflective, almost poetic. Maybe that's why his story still fascinates us. Because in Lucky Luciano we see both the monster and the man, the dreamer who built something eternal, and the realist who knew it couldn't last. His life is a mirror held up to our own ambitions. A reminder that power always comes with a cost, and that the greatest empires are built not on morality, but on understanding. The final montage plays slowly, Luciano as a boy running through the streets of New York. Luciano as a man sitting at the head of the commission table. Luciano as an old soul staring out at the sea in Naples. The narrator's final words are steady, almost whispering. He began as Salvatore Lucania, a boy from Sicily who wanted respect. He became Lucky Luciano, the man who gave crime a conscience and chaos a blueprint. He turned fear into a business and silence into an empire. And though time has buried his body, his shadow still stretches across the world. The music fades to a haunting piano melody. One man. One idea. One system. That was his legacy. That was his curse. The screen fades to black. Then in silence white text appears: "Power doesn't die. It only changes form." The last sound is faint, the click of a lighter, the inhale of smoke, the whisper of the city's night air.